Good day. When I was making my video yesterday in the early hours of Monday morning, I said that it was quite likely that events would take place that you, my viewers, would know about, and that these events would take place before the video itself was published. And so it proved. At the time when I made that comment, I thought that the most likely new development would be something connected to the grain deal. But in the event, it was another attack, another Ukrainian attack on the Kerch Bridge. And this attack was the big story, certainly as far as I can tell, in Russia, connected to the war yesterday. And we've had a fair amount of information about it since then. It seems that the attack was carried out by two sea drones. Ukraine has been operating these drones at high levels of intensity for months now. This is the first time I can recall when one of these drones has actually managed to hit a target and cause damage. Up to this point, when Ukraine has launched these drones, for example, against Sevastopol, as it did again, by the way, just a few days ago, or against Russian surveillance ships, carrying out patrols on the pipelines, the Turk Stream and Blue Stream pipelines in the Black Sea. In every case that I can remember, these drones have been destroyed by the Russians. They've been able to use electronic warfare systems to stop attacks on these drones, by these drones, and on several occasions, in fact on numerous occasions, they've been able to destroy them even as they move over the surface. Now, I say that it was one of these drones that attacked the bridge. There's been suggestions that it was a rather more sophisticated system, a British underwater drone, a submarine drone, which the British supposedly provided to Ukraine. However, I've seen quite a lot of analysis of the attack, and the general consensus seems to be that the pattern of the attack suggests the kind of surface drone that we've seen Ukraine use up to now, rather than these more sophisticated British drones. It seems that there would be complications in using these sophisticated British drones in an attack on the bridge. And anyway, the general consensus seems to discount that idea. So two surface drones were launched by Ukraine. For the first time, Ukraine's heavy investment in this type of technology has borne some fruit. There was an attack on the bridge, and the drones did get through to the bridge, and they did cause some damage. Well, how was it done? Why were the Russians unable to prevent it? And how much damage was done? And what are the long-term consequences? Well, how it was done is, of course, to some extent unknown, but Russian reports, which seem to have their origin with the Russian Ministry of Defense, say that the drones were launched from a mothership, that this ship was an identified dry cargo vessel operating from Odessa. The insinuation is that it was operating somewhere within the area previously covered by the grain deal. I will come to that shortly. And that these two drones were able to operate over some distance and then controlled, presumably either from land or perhaps more plausibly from the mothership, and that they were able to carry out the attack successfully that they did. Now, how did they get through? Well, Again, I've seen various explanations about this, but firstly, a number of things to say about attacks on the Kerch Bridge. This is, of course, the second attack on the Kerch Bridge. There was a previous attack in September last year. I'm going to say straight away that from what I've been able to understand, that attack in September last year did significantly more damage to the bridge than this latest attack has done. So that is a preliminary view based on certain statements that have come out of Russia. I will come back to it shortly, and it may be one that I will have to revise at some point. But anyway, that first attack in September was carried out by a truck that drove onto the Kerch Bridge. It seems that the driver of the truck had no knowledge of the fact that the cargo that he was carrying on the truck, which was apparently fertilizer, had been adapted by Ukrainian operatives into a massive bomb, and that the truck was then detonated whilst on the bridge by remote control. And it did cause damage, significant amount of damage to the bridge. And though the railway part of the bridge appears to have continued to operate, the road bridge itself was damaged, and it took many months, it took several months for this part of the road bridge, for the road bridge to be brought fully back to a state of repair and for the bridge to be able to operate as it had before. Well, that was how that was done on that occasion. A truck drove onto the bridge and carried what in effect were explosives, concealed explosives, and was detonated by a remote device and caused damage that way. Well, it's clear that an operation like that is now extremely difficult, to the point of virtual impossibility. The Russian military now carry out detailed searches of vehicles that operate across the bridge, and sending vehicles in that kind of way across the bridge would be extremely difficult to do, and it looks as if Ukraine, at least for the moment, isn't trying to do it. Now, the other possibility is using cruise missiles, long-range cruise missiles, to attack the bridge. And there's been an awful lot of discussion about how to do this, and the suggestion that some have made, many people have made, is that the type of weapon which could be used to attack the bridge by Ukraine at this time, the most plausible weapon, is the British Storm Shadow missile. Now, this perhaps does, in theory, have the necessary range to reach the bridge from airspace still controlled by Ukraine. But there's been a number of analysts who've discussed the problems. The best summary is by Simplicius the Thinker. The problem with doing this is that though the Storm Shadow, no doubt, could just about reach the bridge, it does suffer from two problems. Firstly, in order to strike at the bridge, it would probably need to cross large bodies of water. That would make it more visible to Russian radar systems, and one must assume that the area of the bridge is heavily protected by Russian air defense units. And that would, since the missile flying over water, even if it was at relatively low altitudes close to the water, would be visible to Russian radar, its stealth capability would be discounted, and more likely than not, it would be shot down. And again, it seems that the Ukrainians understand this, which is why for the moment they don't seem to have sought to attack the bridge with that kind of missile, the Storm Shadow missiles. Ukraine does have other missiles. It's trying to use its own Grom missile, which is a ballistic missile developed by Ukraine. Apparently it was still in development at the time when the current fighting started in February of last year, but Ukraine has been able to assemble a small number of these and has launched them towards Crimea, or tried to. The Grom, however, though it is sometimes compared to the Iskander missile, seems to be significantly less sophisticated, and the Russians have been successful in intercepting the Grom, and so far no Grom missiles have been able to get through. And Ukraine has also recently tried to use a different kind of missile. These are conversions of the S-200 air defense missile developed by the Soviet Union in the 1960s, and for a very long time the mainstay of the Soviet Union's air defense missile force. This was the most widespread missile that the Soviet Union deployed in the 1970s and for part of the 1980s, until it was superseded by the various missiles that now make up the S-300 family. Anyway, Ukraine has converted some of these missiles also to land attack roles, but again the Russians have been successful in intercepting them. The Russians seem to be much more successful in intercepting these types of Ukrainian ballistic missiles than Ukraine has been in intercepting Russian Iskander missiles. And the likely reason for that is twofold. Firstly, Russian air defenses are much more sophisticated nowadays than Ukrainian air defenses are. Ukraine's original air defense system was based on technology, Soviet technology from the 1980s. It was a capable system, but it is not as advanced, obviously, as that which Russia has today. And Ukraine also has, of course, received Western systems, but again, it's largely acknowledged that these systems, even the Patriot, are not really particularly effective in shooting down Russian high-speed ballistic missiles like the Iskander. So Russia has better air defense systems and in much larger quantities, and is able to develop layered defenses to protect a bridge like the Kerch Bridge. And also there is the other factor that the missiles themselves that Ukraine has developed, the Grom and the S-200, certainly seem to be significantly less sophisticated and more easier to shoot down than the Iskander missile, which is the missile that the Russians use. I am going to suggest that one of the reasons why Ukraine has been so insistent on being supplied ATACMS missiles by the United States, and why some of Ukraine's friends in the West have been so keen to supply Ukraine with ATACMS missiles, is because they believe that this supersonic missile, the supersonic cruise missile, is more likely to get through to the bridge and to destroy it than the various missiles, the hodgepodge of missiles, the Storm Shadows, the Scalp missiles that are going to soon arrive from France, the Grom and the converted S-200s that Ukraine is operating at the moment. And I suspect that the reason some people in the Pentagon are unwilling to supply Ukraine with ATACMS missiles, and apart from the fact that the stock of these missiles is relatively small, I suspect that the main reason why, well, one of the reasons why Pentagon officials are not keen on supplying Ukraine with this kind of missile is precisely because they fear that Ukraine might use this missile in attacks against the Kerch Bridge. Now, whether the ATACMS would in fact be able to penetrate the Russian air defense shield around the Kerch Bridge is, of course, another question. I've seen it suggested by several people that subsonic missiles flying at high speeds, high subsonic speeds, like the Storm Shadow, are actually more difficult to shoot down than the ATACMS, though that presumably applies over land rather than sea. But anyway, the Russians have shown an ability to shoot down supersonic missiles. They're able to shoot down HIMARS missiles now and do so on a fairly regular basis. So presumably they could shoot down ATACMS missiles also. Though it might be more difficult for them to do. The other problem with the ATACMS is that apparently it has a relatively small warhead compared to the Iskander or the Storm Shadow. Though I would say that, of course, the hitting power of a supersonic missile must in itself count for something when it reaches its target. But I'm not a technical person about these matters. I'm not going to discuss that further. Now, having said all of this, it is important to say that no air defense system is ever 100% foolproof. Sometimes operators can make mistakes. Sometimes equipment can malfunction. There's always a risk that one day some Ukrainian missiles might get through. And of course, it could be that the Ukrainian missiles, the missiles in Ukraine's army are more sophisticated than is being suggested. And perhaps there are more problems with the Russian air defense system than is being suggested. That is the reality of war. But overall, it seems that Ukraine has made attempts using supersonic missiles to strike at the Kerch Bridge. It basically tried to do that about a week ago with S-200 missiles, as I recall. It's found that it cannot reach the Kerch Bridge with these missiles, and that probably explains why Ukraine has decided to switch to using these drones. And that brings me to the problems that the Russians have with drones, and that is, of course, that the bridge is long. Again, there's a discussion of this by Simplicius the Thinker. These drones operate, they don't leave much of themselves on the surface. They're fairly stealthy, they're difficult to spot, and because of the length of the bridge, the longest bridge in Europe, it's not always easy fully to protect against drones. Well, that's an explanation. I think for what it's worth, it's probably a true explanation. But I'm also going to suggest that there are possibly other reasons why the bridge on this occasion proved vulnerable to drones. And that is that I think that the Russians did not seriously think that an attack with these drones would take place, because I suspect that they thought that either Ukraine had only a relatively limited stock of these drones, which it was using against Sevastopol, or more plausibly that Ukraine would not risk operating these drones from motherships, which is apparently the only way that they would be able to reach the Kerch Bridge, with the motherships having to operate so far into the Black Sea and risk, therefore, their own destruction. That is my own Yes. There's also further speculation about attacks on the bridge, and that is that there's a widespread consensus in Russia that the Kerch Bridge itself is no longer used by the Russian military to transfer military equipment to Ukraine. Now, before the attack in September, it was used by the Russian military to transfer military equipment to Ukraine. I've seen film back in September of large amounts of military equipment being transferred from Krasnodar region to Crimea, across the bridge, tanks and self-propelled guns and all that sort of thing, using, by the way, the railway, not the road bridge. And as I've discussed in the past, it is the railway bridges that, for logistic purposes, really matter, because it is the railways that the Russians use to transport troops and heavy equipment in big volumes. So they did once use it for that purpose, but after the September attack and right up till today, they have ceased to do so. And I think that there are a number of reasons for this. Firstly, they want to make clear that the bridge is purely civilian infrastructure, that it doesn't serve any kind of military purpose, hoping that that will provide the bridge with at least some measure of protection. There is a lot of speculation that there's been some kind of private deal done between the United States and Russia, whereby the Russians have agreed not to use the Kerch Bridge to transport military equipment and personnel from Russia to Ukraine, in return for the United States perhaps not supplying ATACMS missiles and discouraging Ukraine from attacks on the bridge. There's been suggestions and rumors about this. Who knows whether that is true or not? I don't. But anyway, it could be that that is the case, but also, and perhaps much more plausibly, with the Russians having developed their land bridge to Crimea and having apparently refurbished, at least to some extent, the railway systems on the mainland, it's possible for the Russians to keep their troops and equipment reinforced and supplied in Kherson and Zaporozhye region without having to send large numbers of men to Crimea with their various machines and having to redeploy them from Crimea to Zaporozhye and Kherson region in the way that was previously done. It's also, of course, possible that the Russians have already forward positioned all the equipment that they feel they need in Crimea and that there isn't very much need to send more. And to the extent that equipment, heavy equipment and machines, military equipment is sent to Crimea, I get the impression that for some time now this has been done by ship, as it was, by the way, before the bridge was actually built. So there we are. We have an attack on this target. It may not have been, the Russians perhaps weren't fully expecting a drone attack of the kind that we've seen. And perhaps there were difficulties fully protecting the bridge from this sort of drone attack. But having said that, and having said that there might have been reasons why the Russians weren't prepared for this attack, there is nonetheless clear evidence here, and one has to say this, of a failure in Russian precautions and security. If it has become, anything has been clear for many months now, it is that the Ukrainians are obsessed with this bridge. They've been agitating to destroy it for months. They've been talking about doing so for even since long before the conflict itself started, since almost the day when the bridge was completed. They've been complaining about the bridge and talking about the importance of destroying it. They've been saying it's an illegal bridge and a superfluous bridge because it shouldn't be there at all, as Crimea properly belongs to Ukraine. And if the Russians have indeed had some kind of assurances from the United States, they should certainly have known since a couple of weeks ago, when Ukraine first started to launch missiles towards the Kerch region, towards the bridge, that these assurances really didn't amount to very much, and that the Ukrainians were intent on disregarding them. And besides, they should also know by now that private assurances provided by the United States don't always mean very much anyway. And I accept that providing full protection for a structure as large as this bridge is probably a challenging thing to do, but I doubt that it is an impossible one. And I'm frankly surprised that the Russians themselves didn't take steps to secure the bridge from attacks like this type also. So again, one has to say, maybe they have to some extent done. Maybe there were weaknesses in the defenses which the Ukrainians exploited. Of course, there's an awful lot that we don't know. But still, whatever happened, this was, from the Russian point of view, a breach of security, a failure of security. If there were assurances from the United States, in my opinion, they should only have been taken with a heavy dose of skepticism. And it's clear for some time that Ukraine would come back after the bridge. So that brings us to what the results of this incident were and are going to be going forward. And from a military point of view, the short answer is none, since the Russians are not using the bridge to transport troops and military equipment, since it is now only being used for civilian purposes. Damage to the bridge is not going to affect Russian military operations. And from a military point of view, it is an inconsequential event. From a civilian point of view, from the point of view of morale in Crimea and Russia, yes, it has unsettled people in Crimea and Russia, but certainly it will not have done so to anything like the extent that would be needed in order to change feeling about the war. And if it is indeed the case that the damage to the bridge is less extensive than was the case with the attack last year, and if it is indeed the case that, as has been suggested, the bridge will be fully back in service by September, apparently only one spar of the bridge was damaged and has to be replaced. Another spar was also damaged but has apparently been wheeled back into position. The railway bridge is operating as normal. Road traffic is again able to cross the bridge, as it was, by the way, fairly soon after the previous attack, but on a basis of a reverse flow. In other words, only one of the road surfaces is now being used to carry out, to drive over, but it seems that the previous attack did cause some damage to the structure of the bridge. This attack has not. The underlying structural integrity of the bridge this time has been unaffected. Well, if that is all true, then the bridge will be up and running again, assuming that there's no more damage to the bridge, no more attacks on the bridge. get through and cause damage, the bridge will be up and running again, supposedly by sometime in September. That is what is being suggested this time. It will mean that the bridge is no longer in full use during the summer holiday season, when a lot of Russian tourists travel to Crimea for their holidays, and that will be an economic dent for Crimea. But as I said, it's hardly likely to make any fundamental difference ultimately, either to the direction of the conflict or to morale. And in military terms, it's not going to make any difference at all. So that's all I'm going to say about this attack on the bridge. There are a lot of unanswered questions. As I said, we still don't know the whole story about how the drones got through. Putin has called an emergency meeting of his Security Council to discuss this. No doubt more precautions will be taken to secure the bridge. I'm sure that those precautions can be made, and I'm sure that before long the bridge will be relatively safe from seaborne attack. Though, let me reiterate again, one can never make any structure in a war 100% foolproof from attack. There's always a chance that something will get through and cause damage. But anyway, one can certainly reduce the dangers to a significant extent, and I'm sure that will be done. And in the meantime, the Russians are saying that they will carry out retaliatory strikes at some point over the next couple of days against Ukraine. And there's reports that people have been leaving Kiev in large numbers because they're worried about these strikes, and we shall see what they are. The Russians did carry out a number of strikes on Odessa and Nikolaev last night, but Dmitry Peskov, Russia's the press spokesman, President Putin's press spokesman, has said that the retaliatory strikes, the actual retaliatory strikes, are still under consideration, are still being prepared, which suggests that these overnight strikes that we were on Odessa and Nikolaev were already pre-planned and are not part of any retaliatory action connected to this event on the Kerch Bridge. Anyway, that's what I will say about the attack itself. I don't think it's going to change anything in military terms or about the direction of the war. It will result in a beefing up of the security of the bridge. Now, this attack has had the effect of killing 2 civilians, a husband and wife, and leaving their 14-year-old daughter in a critical condition. There's been a lot of criticism and anger about this in Russia. These were people going about their normal lives, travelling, no doubt, to Crimea and back, in connection, I'm guessing, with a holiday. It is a terrible human tragedy. I hope I'm not going to sound callous or cynical in what I'm going to say. I can understand entirely why Putin and other Russian officials are talking about this as a terrorist act. It's an attack on a piece of civilian infrastructure. 2 civilians were killed and a young woman was injured. The fact is, however, that in a conflict, things like this do happen and people die. That is not to excuse or justify the Ukrainian attack. To my mind, it is an exercise not only in callousness, but also in pointlessness. They're attacking a structure which, as I said, has no military use, at the present time. It makes little sense in terms of military activities. It doesn't advance Ukraine's military goals in any way. By the way, the United States, through its anonymous officials, briefed the New York Times some months ago that is what the United States thought about the attack on the first attack on the bridge that took place in September, that they served no real military purpose. In fact, ultimately, they were counterproductive to Ukraine in that they hardened feeling against Ukraine in Russia. So it was a misconceived attack, one that has achieved nothing in military terms, which has killed civilians pointlessly. And though, as I said, this sort of thing, civilians do die in wars, one has to say that using military equipment in this way, targeting civilian infrastructure, killing civilians in this fashion, well, it's needless cruelty. And that is perhaps the worst type of cruelty, the most in war that there is. Why did Ukraine do it? Well, as I said, they've been obsessed with the bridge for some time. But again, I'm going to suggest that this is all very much part of the way in which Ukraine has been fighting this war for some time. The war is not going well. The Ukrainian offensive is bogged down. There's an article in the Washington Post which in its subtitle actually says that Ukraine's offensive is bogged down. And there's frustration, there's concern that Ukraine's Western allies are becoming less supportive of Ukraine in this conflict. There's probably some disappointment about what happened in Vilnius. And of course, there will be frustration and anger about the Russian pullout from the grain deal. So it's perhaps not surprising about that Ukraine has made the decision that it did to attack the bridge. It's the sort of thing that Ukrainians do sometimes do when things go wrong. They launch attacks of this kind, often with little real logic, military logic behind them, as a way of telling themselves and their own people that they're strong, that they can still hit the Russians where it hurts the Russians, giving that impression around the world. Western coverage of this attack, by the way, has been relatively subdued, certainly by comparison with the way in which much of the media in the West talked up and sort of praised the previous attack in September, which suggests to me that from Ukraine's point of view, these sort of attacks now have diminishing returns, and that the West is becoming more disenchanted with attacks of this nature as they begin to understand that they're not going to shake Russian morale and Russian resolve, and that they're not going to change anything on the battlefronts. But anyway, let us now look at the other big piece of news that took place yesterday, and that is Russia's exit from the grain deal. Now, I said that the attack on the Kerch Bridge and the Russian pullout from the grain deal are not connected with each other. Certainly they're not connected in the sense that I'm sure that the Russians did not decide to exit the grain deal because of the attack on the bridge. In fact, they've gone out of their way to say that this was not the case. The Russians have been signaling for weeks that they were intending to exit the grain deal on Monday, on the 17th of July. Ukraine would have known about this. I can imagine that this might have caused the Ukraine to be angry, and it's not impossible that Ukraine has launched this attack to some extent out of anger because the grain deal was coming to an end. Now, again, it's been suggested by some people that Ukraine had reached some kind of implicit understanding not to attack the Kerch Bridge whilst the grain deal was in place. The grain deal was first agreed by Russia and Ukraine through UN mediation and with Turkey also involved back in July last year. Ukraine carried out its first attack on the Kerch Bridge several months later in September, if I remember correctly. It seems hardly likely that Ukraine ever made that kind of a promise. Perhaps something like that was said over the course of the various discussions to extend the grain deal that took place in the past. But I have to say, I think that's extremely unlikely. So it could be that Ukraine planned and prepared for this attack on the bridge, and I presume carrying out an attack like this kind would require several weeks of preparation. Perhaps Ukraine carried out this plan out of anger that the grain deal was ending on the 17th of July. They would have known that that was the case, and it could be that there is a connection there. But there we go. I'm not going to explore that further. I mean, it could be, just to say that these attacks on the Kerch Bridge and on Sevastopol that we've just seen attempted and which failed might have been planned months ago, for all I know, perhaps in tandem with the offensive and with the expectations that the offensive was going better. But certainly I don't think that it has any real link to the end of the grain deal in the way that some people are saying. Despite the coincidence in time, I think Ukraine has always been looking for ways to attack the Kerch Bridge, and I don't think the cancellation of the grain deal would have changed this. So anyway, let's come back to the grain deal and let's discuss what happened. Now, I said a couple of days ago that I was almost sure that when the Russians said that this time it would be final, that they were going to pull out of the grain deal once and for all, that they meant what they said. I have to say that the general consensus, not just of most commentators, but I suspect of many people in the West, was otherwise. The Russians have talked about pulling out of the grain deal in the past, and they've always stepped back from doing it. And I've explained the reasons why in the past. Firstly, the Russians didn't want to upset their friends in Africa, in Turkey, in Latin America, in the Far East, countries where the price of food is an existential matter for many people. Russia did not want to be seen as obstructing the supply of food to these countries. So that was one reason. And helping President Erdogan win re-election undoubtedly was a second reason. So in the second case, that no longer applies. President Erdogan is now re-elected. And in respect of the African states, and this is something, and other states, and this is something which I think many people in the West and some commentators have failed to take note of. The Russians have been for months on a campaign, going around talking to the leaders of the various African countries, talking to the leaders of the East Asian states, talking no doubt to China, pointing out that the grain deal was not actually resulting in food supplies going to these countries that need food most, explaining to these countries why the grain deal was not working for Russia, that their grain exports and their fertilizer exports were still being obstructed, that the Russian Agricultural Bank had not been reconnected to the SWIFT interbank payment system in the way that had been repeatedly promised, that the Western powers were not prepared to provide insurance to Russian ships transporting grain, and last but not least, that Ukraine was undoubtedly using the corridors created for the grain ships, the corridors which the Russians agreed would not become a military zone, that the Ukrainians were using those corridors to launch attacks and strikes on Russian ships and Russian facilities with these drones, and that this was, and also in some cases to transport explosives and other military equipment, and that this was unacceptable, and that it went completely contrary to the terms of the grain deal as it had been originally agreed. That's what the Russians have been saying to their friends around the world. And the fact that the Russians were engaged in that campaign should have alerted people in the West to the fact that they were serious this time about pulling out of the grain deal, but it doesn't seem that it did. And it should also have alerted people in the West to the fact that as the Russians were hardening up their positions on this very issue over the last couple of days and weeks, that would have suggested that these Russian attempts to explain what they were going to do to their friends around the world were gaining traction, and that those friends were not pushing back and were, if not green-lighting what the Russians were going to do, at least showing some understanding of it. And interestingly enough, Russia says that the Africa-Russia summit that it's trying to convene is still going ahead. 39 countries from Africa have already said that they intend to participate. And the Russians, of course, have been going out of their way to say that they are promising that they will supply grain to and other foodstuffs to African countries, to other countries in need, to Ethiopia, to Egypt, to wherever. They're having a good harvest. They expect a good harvest this year. They'll be able to supply grain and food. They're promising that in some cases they will provide it for free. The recent depreciation of the ruble means that the price of exports of Russian food has also probably fallen. And whatever, the Russians probably have probably felt for some time that they'd square the diplomatic circle on this issue, that they had at least understanding from their friends as to why they were pulling out of the grain deal. And that should have alerted, again, the Western powers to the fact that this would happen. And now, of course, it has happened, and it has lost Ukraine $500 million worth of export revenue every month. And at a time when Ukraine's financial dependence on the West is extreme, that is a significant loss in revenue, and one which the Western powers will have to find some means to make up. Having said that, those who I think talk up this issue, they need to keep in mind that the $6 billion that it would cost the West to sustain, to make up the difference for Ukraine's losses in terms of export revenue, in terms of reduction in grain and other foodstuffs. Well, $6 billion is small change in the West nowadays. So I don't think that this is a major concern. What will be a much more serious concern is that there will be less food going towards developing countries. Now, it's actually quite interesting to look at which blocks of countries have been receiving most of Ukraine's food exports. And there's been a rather interesting series of various commentators have provided their own statistics. But overall, the biggest buyer of Ukrainian food has been China, followed by the European Union, various states within the European Union taken together, and then Turkey, except that it's fairly well known that Turkey, which is itself a food exporter, re-exports some of this food that it's been receiving from Ukraine to the EU, which actually probably means that the EU overall actually surpasses China as the main export destination of much of this food. And it seems that a lot of the single biggest item that's exported is maize, and there's been other products, oilseeds and those kind of things. I get the sense that a lot of this food that is being exported basically goes into animal feed in Europe and probably in China as well. Now, in China, the loss of this food is going to be a problem, but probably not a significant problem. The Russians probably can make the difference, but food inflation in China is very low at the moment, as by the way, is inflation generally. In fact, there's been talk in China that there is overall a worry of the Chinese economy falling into deflation. So this is probably not going to be a huge problem in China. In the West, it might be, in the sense that food exports from Ukraine, or rather food imports from Ukraine, do seem to be playing a significant role in reducing food prices in Europe. And of course, if food prices start rising again, then that could cause inflation to rise, especially as this seems to be happening at a time when energy prices, oil prices, are already rising, and at a time when the International Energy Authority is warning Europe that it is being altogether too complacent about its situation with natural gas for the winter. It's warning that even if the gas reserves are full, what enabled Europe to come through the winter without energy shortages and spiraling energy costs, or at least costs of gas spiraling out of control, was the fact that the winter was warm and, by the way, a significant reduction in industrial manufacturing production, and also, of course, the fact that nuclear plants in Germany at that time were still operating. Well, perhaps the winter will be comparably warm. The next winter that's coming might be comparably warm, but it could also be a lot colder. Those 3 nuclear plants have now been closed down. And of course, there is another factor at play, which is that the Chinese economy has reopened. And again, there's been lots of talk about the state of the Chinese economy. There's been articles appearing in the Financial Times and in The Economist that suggest that the Chinese economy has lost momentum and things like this. The reality, according to Chinese statistics, is that Chinese growth increased year on year by 6.3% in the second quarter, and looks like it will be achieving at least 5 to 5.5% growth this year. So I'm not quite sure where people see this loss of momentum. It seems that, as far as I can see, that the Chinese economy is growing at roughly the speed that Chinese officials said it would. Anyway, the point is that China is going to be buying more of the food that Russia is producing to make up for the Ukrainian food that it will not be receiving. The Russians have said that they will supply food to the poorer countries that need it at lower prices and sometimes for free. And Ukrainian food will not be there, all at a time when the Russians have now agreed to production cuts in oil production, and when the Chinese might again, with their economy growing once more, might be there also buying liquefied natural gas. Last winter, they were still largely in lockdown, and this winter, they might also need more liquefied natural gas, and they might once again become a buyer. I'm not predicting this. There are also clear signs now of deepening recession problems across the Western economies, which are depressing demand right across the board. But if there is an uptick in inflation this autumn and during the winter, with pressures on energy costs and with the cancellation of this deal also adding further pressures on food prices, well, then I would not be surprised. And of course, if that happens, it will be a disaster, especially for the Europeans, who will have to confront the fact that they're short of energy, or at least that energy prices are rising again. Inflation is rising again, even as their economies slip deeper into recession. It really will be a case of stagflation having struck home with a vengeance. Anyway, there we are. So I am not in the slightest bit surprised myself that the grain deal is over. I thought at the time that when Putin made those comments, at that staged press conference a couple of days ago, I think it was last Thursday, in which he seemed to be saying that the grain deal really was going to end, it seemed to me that that really was the clearest possible sign that it was going to end, and that this game that the Western powers have played of stringing Russia along pressuring it to keep the grain deal going, criticizing it for starving the poorest nations by not performing its side of the grain deal. At the same time, slow walking Western compliance with its part of the grain deal, which was never fully implemented, looking the other way, in fact never implemented at all, looking the other way whilst Ukraine itself violated its terms. Anyway, this attempt to string the Russians along was misconceived and has now failed. And if there is an uptick in inflation, in food price inflation in the West, in the autumn and in the winter, well, and if that has any connection with the ending of the grain deal, which it might do, well, all I could say is that not for the first time, Western miscalculations have brought that about. Anyway, we shall see. I would finish this discussion at the grain deal by saying that it is not inconceivable, but I think extremely unlikely that it might one day be revived. Putin did leave open the possibility that if the West did take steps to revive the grain deal by, for example, reconnecting the Russian Agricultural Bank to SWIFT, if more serious things were done over the next few months, then Russia might reconsider its decision. But frankly, that seems most unlikely at the moment. And the Russians are saying that their pullout of the grain deal is final. So there we are. An attack on the Kerch Bridge, which is of no military significance, is a gratuitous attack on a civilian target that has killed civilians, 2 civilians, and badly injured a young woman. As I said, in and of itself, something that happens in war, and far more civilians have been killed over the course of this war than just those 3. But as I said, it does seem very brutal and frankly callous to carry out this kind of attack and to expend also technology and equipment and machinery over something that gains you no military advantage. Even the shelling of Belgorod and Donetsk city, which, to be very clear, I don't agree with at all. I think it's completely wrong. But I can see some kind of rationale behind that, in the sense that it diverts Russian resources to trying to protect places like Belgorod and Donetsk, resources which might be used in other places. But that's hardly likely to be true over an attack like the Kerch Bridge. And to be honest, I cannot see any purpose in this attack. And I recoil from an attack. I recoil against an attack which seems as purposeless as this one. Anyway, so that kind of an attack on the Kerch Bridge, mainly a media operation as far as I can see, and one which will achieve Ukraine, will gain for Ukraine nothing, and a cancellation of a grain deal, largely because the West never prioritized working to consolidate it. It never performed its side of the bargain. I don't think it will have perhaps quite the economic effect that some people think, because in my opinion, with recessionary forces intensifying in the West, it's more likely than not that inflation will continue to fall, especially if the recession, as it increasingly looks like, is going to be severe. But of course, it could result in an uptick in inflation, as is pointed out by people like Peter Schiff. Even if prices overall fall in a situation, even in a situation because of the general economic situation, if you do something that causes those prices, even if they're falling, to still remain higher than they would otherwise have been, that remains a type of inflation. And that's an entirely valid point, it seems to me. So anyway, I don't know what the global effect of this is going to be, but if it does result in higher food prices in the West over the next few weeks and months, adding to inflationary pressures, which may be starting to grow as demand for energy and food from China increases, with the economy there growing, well, if that's what happens, then all I can say is that once again, attempting to string the Russians along in the way that has been done so many times in the past will have been counterproductive. So that's all I'm going to say about these two topics, the grain deal and the attack on the Kerch Bridge. I mean, it's possible that I will have to return to them, but I don't anticipate doing so. What is happening on the battlefronts? Well, I'm not going to devote a huge amount of time to it today. This has already been a long video, but I'm going to say that the situation continues as it has done until now. Ukraine continues to launch attacks in various places along the southern front lines and in the area around Bakhmut. But the Russians seem to be pressing forward with their offensive in the north, in Kupiansk and towards Liman. And maps which I have seen now suggest that they are very close to Kupiansk and getting pretty close to Liman as well. And there's been lots of talk about Ukrainian counterattacks to try to slow this Russian advance. But the word is that all of those attacks, these counterattacks, have failed. And there's been some increasingly alarmist comments about the progress of this Russian offensive coming out of Ukraine. Comments, by the way, which I've noticed that the Western media seems to be completely disregarding. There was an astonishing one claiming that the Russian forces in this area number 100,000 men, that they have 900 tanks and hundreds of guns and all sorts of things. I should say that most Russian commentators have scoffed at these figures, saying that they're wildly exaggerated. But anyway, who's to know? There's also, by the way, another claim that General Surovikin, no less, has been appointed overall commander of a reserve force numbering 180,000 men, and it could be that he is the person who is now in overall charge of this offensive. Well, that might be true as well, but I have seen no confirmation of it. But anyway, lots of things like that going on in the north, but no sign of any breakthrough by Ukraine itself, where it is attacking. The Russians moving, as I said, closer to Kupiansk, moving closer to Liman. The Ukrainians getting concerned about this, starting to try to redeploy troops and equipment perhaps to this area to try to slow the Russian advance down. There was a report that the Russians were able to destroy a trainload of equipment, which included Leopard 2 tanks that were being urgently redeployed by Ukraine to try to slow down this offensive. But anyway, that is the overall situation on the battle lines. Indeed, just before I started making this program, I read of another Ukrainian attack in Zaporozhye towards the village of Rabutino, deserted village, fought over. Ukraine has been trying to capture this village for weeks now, ever since the offensive began. And again, apparently this particular attack collapsed. And there's now growing signs of concern in the United States. The title, the lead article in the Washington Post today is that Ukraine aims to sap Russia's defenses as US urges a decisive breakthrough. And it says that Ukraine, the subtitle is Ukraine is making limited gains, limited advances recapturing Russian-held territory. I'm not sure where these limited advances are, because as of the moment, I've seen no real sign of Ukraine making any advances at all. In the Bakhmut area, for example, it does seem as if they've been successfully pushed back in terms of the offensives that they were trying to launch there. But anyway, Ukraine is making limited advances recapturing Russian-held territory, but has yet to employ the large-scale operations its forces have been trained on. Well, I'm not going to read the article itself, but the last is obviously not true. We've had major Ukrainian attacks. They took place in the first few weeks of this offensive, and we had an article in the New York Times that tells us that these attacks were disastrous. There have been articles in the New York Times about this, by Forbes, in all sorts of places. So I don't understand how it is possible to say that Ukraine has not yet employed large-scale operations that its forces have been trained on. It clearly has done. And according to the New York Times, in the first few weeks, it lost 20% of the armored vehicles that it employed in trying to conduct these large-scale operations. So what articles like this suggest to me, and as I say, it's the lead article in the Washington Post, is that there's now growing tensions and arguments between the Ukrainians and the Americans. The Ukrainians are telling the Americans that they simply cannot do with the resources that they have that which the Americans have been pressing them to do: advance to the Black Sea, to the Sea of Azov, cutting the Russian land bridge, breaking through these great Russian fortified lines that they haven't even reached. They can't do it without far more equipment, without far more munitions, without air support, and all of those things. And the Americans, coming back in exasperation, telling Ukraine that they've had all the equipment that they need. They've been saying this since well before the offensive started, that there's nothing more that can be sent at the moment, that they've run out of shells in the United States and can only provide cluster munitions, that the F-16s can't be supplied soon, nor can the ATACMS, that Ukraine has all it needs and must therefore carry out this great breakthrough attack, because that was the reason why the United States agreed to provide all those Bradleys and Strykers and all those shells in the first place. Well, we'll see where this argument goes, but it does look for the moment as if Ukraine is at a standstill, and whilst the Russians continue their advance, And I'm going to suggest that given this argument, it perhaps explains why Ukraine is resorting to these theatrical attacks on the Kerch Bridge, but it also almost certainly means that the United States, the Biden administration, which has staked so much on the success of this offensive, staked so much politically, but has also depleted America's own military reserves in order to make this offensive possible, and therefore has opened itself to criticism by the Republicans in Congress, who are starting to turn against the war. 70 of them voted against the supply of cluster munitions. Some Democrats did also. The criticism from that quarter, perhaps criticism from some people in the military as well. The Biden administration has found itself exposed. I suspect that one person who finds himself particularly vulnerable to criticism is the US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, who has authorized all these arms transfers to Ukraine, perhaps overriding doubts from some people in the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Anyway, they are probably not going to be impressed by pieces of theatre like the Kerch Bridge affair, even as they see the offensive upon which they staked so much failing, and sense the coming failure of their Ukraine policy. Anyway, that is where I finish today. As I said, I don't expect to return to the Kerch Bridge and grain deal stories, at least not for a while. Certainly the grain deal story, I think, has probably run its course. There might be Russian naval operations in the Black Sea, which we haven't seen for a while. It could be. There's some rumours that the Russians intend to reoccupy Snake Island. Well, we'll see whether they do that or not, and that they might be planning some kind of amphibious attack on Odessa. We'll see whether they do anything like that either. I doubt it, by the way. But the Kerch Bridge affair, there might be some more things to discuss when the Russian retaliation starts to take shape over the next couple of days. But one should not lose sight of the underlying truth in the conflict up to now. Ukraine launched its great offensive on the 4th of June after months of preparation. The hopes of its supporters, particularly in London and in the White House, were riding on the success of that offensive. The offensive is failing. It is the Russians, not Ukraine, that is gaining the ground at the moment in the north, threatening Kupiansk and threatening Liman. And Ukraine's allies are becoming increasingly, in fact, nervous and angry. That's where I finish my program. More from me soon. Let me wish you all again a very good day and remind you again briefly that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram, as well as you can support our work also via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can go to our shop and buy the great things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, please remember, if you like this video, you can press the like button and check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.